Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening. Welcome to the show. Great to have your company as always. Look, a packed show for you tonight. We've got the latest out of that caucus meeting in Canberra and all the headlines. Here's what's coming up tonight on Credlin. More evidence out today that Australia is nowhere near building enough renewables to meet our over-the-top targets for 2030. So if this is the reality, why is Labor and much of the Teal crossbench still pushing us to do more when it comes to emissions and putting power prices and reliability at risk? Joining me tonight to defend Australia Day with a tough message for woke corporates trying to talk down our country is former Prime Minister Tony Abbott. It comes as Woolies today is in damage control, putting a big ad in the papers trying to win back patriotic customers it has offended. Plus, I'll have all the details you need to know about Labor's all but confirmed decision to dump those Stage 3 tax cuts. And I'll also expose the little secret the Prime Minister doesn't want you to know about bracket creep, because roughly 1.5 million Australians will be forced into the highest tax bracket because of his broken promise. And a barnstorming win today for Donald Trump in the New Hampshire primary. With Iowa, it's now 2 for 2, and it's hard to see him not picking up the Republican nomination now.
We've won almost every single poll in the last 3 months against crooked Joe Biden, almost every poll. And she doesn't win those polls.
But first, all but confirmed today that Labor is indeed breaking its solemn pledge, repeated over 100 times before the election, to keep the Stage 3 tax cuts as legislated. Legislation, of course, that Labor voted for, and a promise they took to 2 federal elections.
Labor will support all of the legislated tax cuts which are in place now. Of course, tax cuts were legislated earlier on in this term, and we've said that we won't seek to change those legislated tax cuts.
And I've said on the Stage 3 tax cuts that they've been legislated. People are entitled to operate on the basis of that certainty.
As a result of this broken promise, taxpayers on $45,000 a year will be $804 better off, and taxpayers on $200,000 a year will be $4,500 worse off. But fiddling with these tax cuts, as Labor now plans to do, means 1.5 million Australians will be hit with bracket creep over the next decade that this tax reform was meant to fix. And let's not forget that some in the media seem to have forgotten this. These tax cuts are not the government giving us its money from government coffers. This is the government not taking so much of our money out of our pockets in the first place. It's not the government being generous to us. It's the government getting its hand out of our pocket at least a little. Now, if these Stage 3 tax cuts are wrong in principle now, why weren't they wrong in principle then when Labor supported them, when they voted for them, and when they took them to 2 elections? Now, there are 2 massive problems here for Labor. The first, there's the broken promise. And governments shouldn't make promises they never intend to keep, especially when they're also pledging to restore integrity in government. So this broken promise looks like hypocrisy as well as a breach of faith. Second, there's the rollback of one of the few genuine economic reforms of the past decade. The Morrison government's change to a flatter tax system, one that incentivises people who want to work hard and get ahead. And then there's 2 further points. Because the government could, with its surprise surplus, have made the tax cuts for lower income earners bigger without breaking its promise to those on higher incomes. But because they're doing it anyway, this looks like a measure of class war envy. So much for another one of the PM's pre-election commitments that he said he'd matured on from his days when he was a I hate Tories undergraduate lefty. As well, most of the losers from this change will be in the Teal seats, who now have a reason to feel ripped off by the Albanese government. And people in these rich seats can't punish Labor by voting Teal. They can only punish Labor by voting Liberal. At one level, maybe this isn't as impactful a broken promise as Julia Gillard's broken promise not to have a carbon tax. Here, only a minority of taxpayers will end up getting hurt. But unlike Gillard's promise, the Prime Minister's Stage 3 tax cuts pledge was repeated over and over again.
My word is my bond. People are entitled to have that certainty of the tax cuts that have been legislated, the certainty that comes through legislated tax changes, and we intend to fulfil that. I can confirm that we haven't changed our position. We have no change to our plans. Tax cuts will happen in July. We haven't changed our position. I've said we haven't changed our position. We haven't changed our position on the Stage 3 tax cut.
Some of those commitments are as recent as Wednesday, this time last week. And unlike Gillard's broken promise, this broken promise wasn't forced on the Prime Minister by a hostile crossbench. This is a deliberate, premeditated broken promise that Labor did not need to do. So make no mistake, this will hurt the government. It should hurt the government with anyone who values political integrity. And if it does turn out to be a one-term wonder, well, this was seen as the turning point, no less than the PM's epic failure, misjudgment over the voice. Look, with Australia Day almost upon us and I read your messages, I tell you, you think this, I think this. Isn't it time for the haters to shut up? What happened on that first Australia Day, January 26, 1788, was a good thing, not a bad thing. It marked the coming to this continent of law, liberty, science and written language. And that was eventually a good thing for everyone, including Aboriginal people, at least after the initial exposure to new diseases and the occasional violence on the frontier, because everyone benefited from the developing understanding here in Australia that women and children and people of different races and religions all had the same rights. Now, I know that our history isn't perfect. No country's got a perfect history, but you can't change the past. And ours is much more a story of pride than shame. If it were not, why do we have a slight over-representation of Aboriginal people in our national parliament, elected by not just Aboriginal people? And why is our country a magnet from people from all over the world, many from non-English speaking backgrounds, who would hardly be attracted to a country that was as racist and unfair as the quasi-Marxist activists want to claim? And if we're really that bad, how come Aboriginal women, yes, black women, not just black men, had the vote in South Australia way back in 1894? As we've been discussing, this outbreak of angst over our National Day has now become an annual spectacle that goes on all January, even though there's no better candidate to be our National Day than the 26th. And anyway, most of the Change the Date Brigade want to abolish Australia Day, not change it. It's demeaning to have this debate every year about whether our country is worth celebrating, because plainly it is. So let's put this pointless and counterproductive debate behind us once and for all. Now, one way to do this might be something proposed by Liberal backbencher Henry Pike. He's got a private members' bill on the table that says any change to the date of Australia Day must and can only be done via a plebiscite. Now, if Peter Dutton were to propose that or something like it, it would not be a distracting culture war. It would actually be ending this particular culture war in the way that all the polls say the voters want it ended. Let's keep Australia Day forever, lock it in and celebrate it properly. Right, busy day in Canberra. All those Labor MPs on your dime there, over at the Lodge now for their drinks. Joining me now with the headlines, Sky News political reporter Olivia Casely.
Good evening. The Prime Minister says a major shake-up to Stage 3 tax cuts is necessary to help struggling households.
My job isn't to say
I'll just wring my hands about cost of living pressure that people are feeling. My job is to respond, to seek advice and then to make a difference.
As it stands, the legislated cuts are skewed in favour of higher income earners. The expected tweak will redistribute this among the lowest income earners, which welfare groups and the unions are embracing. The net effect of this means people earning up to $150,000 will be better off than they would have been under the current package. But the benefit for those on the highest incomes will be almost halved. It's setting the government up for a bitter stoush with the coalition and business groups who are going nuclear over a broken election promise. The full details of the government's tax changes and cost of living relief will be unveiled at the National Press Club on Thursday. The federal government has endorsed Kim Williams to become the next chair of the ABC. He'll replace Ita Buttrose, who confirmed late last year she would not seek a second term. Kim Williams has long been associated with Australia's media and arts landscape, having held several high-profile positions, including News Limited Chief Executive and Sydney Opera House Trust Chairman.
Kim is such a perfect fit for the role, it's almost as if he were made for it. He is as much at home running media companies as he is running arts organisations and indeed former AFL Commissioner.
He's committed to ensuring the ABC offers journalism with freedom from bias.
I might add, Kim Williams is also the son-in-law of Gough Whitlam. I think that's as much a credential for the Prime Minister as anything else. All right, a busy day in Canberra. For their take on a busy day, let's bring in Sky News senior reporter Carolyn Marcus and our political reporter in Canberra, Cameron Reddard. Well, Cam, we haven't had you on the show, but I've watched you closely. Delighted to have your company tonight. Let's start with you if I can. That picture opportunity that the PM had with all these backbenchers today after a cabinet meeting yesterday to announce stuff that he's already got in a speech he's going to deliver tomorrow. Cost us all $500,000 at least. What's the latest from inside Parliament House tonight? As I said, the PMs have headed, the MPs have headed off for their drinks with the PM at the Lodge. What's the latest?
Yeah, I wonder how many of those MPs, Peter, are having a slightly stiffer drink tonight after the way the caucus went, particularly those on thinner margins. I think the last count I did, there were 13 Labor MPs on a margin of 5% or less. And they're the ones that are really banking on the Prime Minister being able to sell this message. The message is coming out of caucus at the moment, of course, from some of the MPs that have been allowed to comment on the record, saying that it is unanimous support within that room. But, Peter, the challenge here really for the Prime Minister is if you're going to break the promise, you're going to have to make the sell job stick. He's now sold it to his colleagues. Tomorrow is the big sell to the nation. I think what makes it so interesting, Peter, is at the end of last year, we know there was some agitation from Labor MPs who were saying to senior members of the team that when people came up to them on the street, there weren't enough concrete measures they could point to say, this is how I'm helping you. You know, you could rattle off cheaper childcare, cheaper medicine, but if you weren't sick and you didn't have kids, then some of those MPs were struggling to sell that message. So even though some might now be able to say, well, you're getting XYZ tax cut, there'll also be some of them walking out of that caucus room today thinking, well, hang on, I'm on a 2% margin here. If you can't make this stick, then I'm in real trouble.
Yeah, Caroline, Cam's right there because he's hoping, or he's rolling the dice, that the class war rhetoric here that he will and all Labor MPs deploy now will trump the broken promise argument that I think the other side are going to run, and certainly most commentators certainly have picked up on. I mean, the Prime Minister's on camera 100 plus times. It's hard for him to hide from that. But the concern I'd have if I was a marginal seat member, well, mate, you told me all of this with the voice. You said we had that in the bag and you were a terrible salesman there, and then you've hid your head under the doona ever since. So I don't know that he's got a lot of currency with the caucus about being a big picture salesman. We'll see. But what about those teals? I mean, they ran a campaign last year about integrity in politics, but they're the ones out there urging the PM to break this commitment on these tax cuts. And of course, it'll hit their voters harder than anyone else.
There seems to be a lot of hypocrisy there from the Teals. Perhaps no huge surprise given some of the stories we've covered about the Teals in the last few years. Peter, I note that some of them, though, are not in support of changes to the tax cuts, like Allegra Spender, who is, of course, the MP, the federal MP for the wealthiest electorate in the country in Wentworth. She clearly sees that this is not going to play well with voters. But look, you're right. I don't think it matters how good a salesman he is. At the end of the day, while this is going to changes to the tax cuts provide some relief, a lot of relief for those lower to middle income earners, it is essentially a broken promise that Anthony Albanese is never going to be able to run away from. And I think that politics is a lot like relationships. If someone betrays you once, are you ever going to trust anything else that person is going to be able to say? Because fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. So when it comes to the next vote, any voter who goes to the polls and believes what Anthony Albanese and his government tells them are going to have to think twice about whether they can really trust it. He still hasn't delivered on his $275 power bill cost cut, and he's already backflipped on these promises.
All right, let's go to Woolworths, because this is interesting. You know, trying to brazen out their announcement last week or the week before, it might have been, that they weren't going to have any Australia Day merchandise in their stores. Well, they're in trouble. Consumers don't like it. They've been in the negative media space ever since that announcement. And there's obviously those accusations of price gouging by the big supermarkets as well. The CEO, Brad Banducci, he's been forced to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars today taking out full-page ads in the paper, trying to tell his customers that they're not trying to cancel Australia Day. You know, they're good corporate citizens. You know, you've read it all wrong. He also did rounds on breakfast radio and TV. Have a look.
We are celebrating Australia and what it means to be Australia with the way we can celebrate it best, which is with food. Well, we could have done a better job of explaining the decision. That's clearly that's true. It has not gone down badly. It's a decision we made collectively as a team. Let's treat each other with respect, which is the hallmark of why we all love and live in Australia.
And Cam, look, there was a leaked letter this afternoon from the CEO trying to explain to staff how their position on Australia Day differs from all the other cultural celebrations, Deepavali, Chinese New Year, etc., which they do support, but Australia Day, which they don't.
Yeah, talk about making a pretty simple issue rather complicated, Peter. The supermarkets are already under the pump broadly with a number of inquiries. There are accusations of price gouging, complaints about not paying farmers or producers properly. Woolworths bringing this upon themselves doesn't seem to have helped their case much at all. They say it's a commercial decision that people aren't buying enough of the product to stock it anymore. We'll see when Coles and IGA and others that do stock this report. I'm sure they'll make a point of how much they sell or otherwise. But at a time when the supermarkets are really under the microscope and people are asking them to meet them halfway and to step up and meet those community expectations around price and other things, it seems quite curious to bring this conversation on and to lean into it.
What about this one, Caroline, another Albanese government failure? This is the federal government doing nothing about pro-Palestinian teachers indoctrinating students. The Australian's got a report today, say some of them are still teaching in schools in Melbourne, despite openly endorsing the October 7 attacks on Israelis. Now, this is not pro-Palestinian messaging. This is pro-Hamas messaging. Education Minister Jason Clare and the Victorian Education Department have so far failed to provide any clarity. Now, no one wants their child being taught, Caroline, with someone who openly supports terrorism, but what's the government doing about it?
Well, not very much, clearly. And let's just spell it out for people exactly what this particular teacher had said at that public rally. This is Jason Wong, the Melbourne public high school teacher that you just showed on the screen there. He said Hamas is doing exactly what they have to do, i.e. the worst terror attack since September 11, the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust, is what needed to be done. I mean, it's a similar rhetoric that we've heard across a lot of these pro-Palestinian protests, that this is some kind of legitimate resistance, terror attacks on innocent civilians. It's absolutely abhorrent. And frankly, the government needs to take action when it's someone who is employed in a public school and who we have heard nothing about whether or not he's still teaching there. We can only assume that he has, because the Victorian Education Department refuses to confirm otherwise. This person has no place teaching children, and he has no place in a school where he could come into contact with particularly Jewish students, who I would be deeply concerned about being exposed to someone with those types of abhorrent views.
Just quickly though, the New South Wales Labor Minister, Jihad Dib, I mean, his wife is a teacher. She's been embroiled in pro-Palestinian activism, and he basically excused it today, or part apologised for it, in the sense that he said, look, she's not a public figure, she can do what she likes.
Well, in terms of Jihad Dib's wife, her comments were disturbing, the ones that were exposed by our colleague Shari Marks. And earlier this week, she told this Zoom meeting of pro-Palestinian teachers that she was Jihad Dib's wife, and that she discussed the possibility with them of protests outside the Premier's office, outside Jason Clare's office. And she discussed how she'd been previously disciplined. I do have some sympathy for Mr. Dib here, because these weren't his comments, and his wife is a private citizen, but she is also a school teacher, and they have no place doing that type of activism in their schools, which is what they were discussing, talking about going to schools dressed in keffiyehs, injecting activism into classrooms, into maths and English classrooms. None of that has a place. I imagine he'd be deeply embarrassed. He's a close ally of Chris Minns, but and we should ask him the questions, but I don't think it is also fair to put the blame on him either.
All right, Carolyn Marcus, thank you, Cameron, and great to have you on the show. We'll see you again soon. All right, it's hard to keep up, isn't it? With all the lofty goals in terms of renewables that the government made pre-election, but now, confirmed yet again, have no hope of delivering. The cut to power bills, well, that's nowhere to be seen. Building 1.2 million homes over 5 years, well, that's nowhere to be seen. In fact, we've got builders hitting the wall, and of course, renewables. Well, there's modelling out today from AEMO Services. This is the New South Wales government body that's playing a major role in the state's energy transition. It says and shows that Australia won't be able to build and install enough renewable energy generation to meet our target for 2030. For more on this, Environment Editor at The Australian, Graham Lloyd, joins me. Well, it's a big target. 82% of our country's energy was supposed to go renewables by 2030. We've been sceptical from day one, but now even the experts are saying it can't happen. So what's going to be the result there with Chris Bowen? Is he going to admit defeat and give us our power grid back?
Well, you can only wish, Peter, but look, this is a bit of a reality check from AEMO Services, and they're saying what everybody really should have known. If the whole world tries to do something all at the same time, it's more difficult to do. So that you have cost price inflation and you have competition for resources, and the scale of the build is just more difficult than it is on paper. Chris Bowen is sort of trying to take a new tack on this and say, oh no, we've introduced a new subsidy scheme. It's going to get things moving faster. But in a way, he's missing the point. It's not about the money that's available. It's about the capacity to source the materials and get things done. And it extends beyond simply the generation capacity. It's distribution and everything as well. And there's similar problems.
So Vincent de Paul report today that a record number of Australians are expected to be unable to pay their bills. Hardship payments are on the rise. This is a long way off the promised cut to our power bills that the government made at the last election, isn't it?
It is, and this is the hard reality of what's happening here. Inevitably, things are going to become more expensive. So the government's agenda appears to be to shift this cost off the power bill and onto the taxpayer balance sheet. And that really only exacerbates the whole thing we're seeing with the stage 3 tax cuts debates. Fewer and fewer people end up paying more and more of everybody else's needs.
Malcolm Turnbull loves his green energy. He has, though, sensationally quit the board of an Andrew Forrest green energy outfit. Now, he joined it with a lot of fanfare. He's slipped off it now. He's not the only one. It seems almost every second day we've got someone else quitting one of these twiggy green enterprises. I mean, are any of them viable, Graham?
Well, this is what needs to be seen, and the truth is that Andrew Forrest has shown himself very adept at chasing where the subsidies are. He's moved a lot of his interest over to the United States because of Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. He's put a big project in New South Wales to really cement his relationship with the federal government, but we're not seeing what the dollar cost of that is. I think with Malcolm Turnbull, the extraordinary thing perhaps is he lasted so long. There's a sort of pretty small tent for some very big egos, and what we're seeing is that they really don't get along all that well together.
I would have said two very interesting bulls in the same paddock, but we're on the same wavelength. Graham Lloyd, thank you as always. Now, just before the break, you remember I reported on Monday that our population was tipped to hit 27 million Australians tomorrow. Well, it looks like that prediction's come in a day early. The Australian Bureau of Statistics, the ABS, has said Australia clocked 27 million today. Now, keep in mind, those predictions of us reaching 26 million, we're now at 27, well, they were 30 years out. We weren't meant to get there until 2042. There you go. After the break, Tony Abbott joins me to discuss the fallout from Labor's tax betrayal. How big is this politically? Plus Australia Day, the former PM says he's had enough of those who want to run our country into the ground. Plus, a little later on, the panel will weigh in on a push by Muslim clerics to lobby federal Labor to wipe the HECS debts of Islamic uni students because they say debt interest offends their religion. Welcome back. Still to come, a fired-up panel for you on Wednesday. Plus, Kel Richards with a bit of an Australia Day flavour this week. But first, I know I don't like it like you do, this constant debate we have running down our country. Come Friday on Australia Day, I'm going to celebrate the greatest country on earth, and I'm sure you're going to do that too. But we keep having to suffer these outbursts from the perpetually outraged whose grievance, let's be honest, is less about the day and more about their growing hatred of our country. It's insufferable, and this year it seems to have got to a fever pitch. But if there's a silver lining, it appears it's not working. In fact, the opposite. I played remarks a little earlier on from the Woolies boss, who's now clearly in damage control and big ads in the paper and all of that. Then there's the boss of Cricket Australia, Nick Hockley, who couldn't even explain coherently their position on the day. He's now trying...
We want everyone to come along and have the most fantastic time to celebrate Australia Day.
But you won't mention Australia Day.
We're seeking to be as inclusive and welcoming as possible.
All right, well, I don't know how you're including the majority of Australians who want to celebrate the National Day.
We are not precluding anybody celebrating Australia Day. We're not boycotting Australia Day. We're playing Test cricket on Australia Day.
I understand that you're just not mentioning it either, right?
We encourage people to come to the cricket and celebrate on Australia Day.
I don't know. I think being a Pom saying all of that grates on me. I think he's a Pom. He certainly doesn't have an Australian accent. But I mean, trying to say Australia Day isn't banned, but they won't use the words, won't make any reference to it. You try and make sense of all of that. Joining me, someone is not shy in defending our country or our National Day, former Prime Minister Tony Abbott. Well, great to have your company yet again to kick off 2024. But I don't know about you. I get sick to get into January, straight after New Year's Eve, basically. We start this month-long self-loathing. How do we get to this position where we're told we have to hate our country or we're not really Australian now?
Peter, you put it very well in your editorial tonight. You said very clearly that what happened on the 26th of January 1788 was a good thing, not a bad thing. It wasn't the arrival in this country of oppression and racism. It was the arrival on this continent of law, of liberty, of literature, of science. And in the long run, that's been good for everyone, including Aboriginal Australians, because all of us, Aboriginal, descendants of the First Fleet, recent arrivals, all of us live in a country which by any standard is free, it's fair, it's prosperous and it's safe. And I just think we have to get over this national angst, accept our history as it is, the overwhelmingly good as well as the bad, and make the most of the country we are and make it better.
You got to feel though, for the majority of Australians, they love this day. They've got no truck with destroying Australia Day or our sense of pride in our country, but they don't get a lot of say. I mean, the Prime Minister says he backs Australia Day, but he's basically allowing everyone to walk away from it, so it's getting rid of it by stealth. He hasn't got the guts to say no Australia Day on the 26th. You've got all these corporates, just like they were in The Voice, lecturing us on high. What does the ordinary Australian do to get their day back when the majority of us support Australia Day on the 26th?
This is exactly right, Peter. And I think that all of those in elite positions have got to get with the program. And the people made it absolutely crystal clear last year in the Voice referendum that they don't want our country divided, and they don't like being told that our history is something to be ashamed of rather than to be proud of. So I just think that it's time to say we've had this debate about Australia Day. It's been won by the people who think that Australia Day should stay on January the 26th, that Australia is, on balance, an overwhelmingly good country that deserves to be celebrated. You're right. The head of Cricket Australia sounded like he was a migrant. The head of Woolies sounded like he's a migrant, and good on them for choosing this country. But they obviously chose this country because they thought it was, on balance, a very good country. So they should give up this pandering to political correctness. If they think our country is a good country, worth coming to, therefore worth celebrating, why don't they tell their organisations and institutions, let's recognise and celebrate our country on its National Day?
I know you don't like to weigh into sort of the day-to-day politics, but I've got to ask you about tax reform. Given it was legislated, given the government took it to 2 elections, this is a huge broken promise. But Labor's very much trying to sell it as a class war fight. How big do you think this is politically? Because, I mean, you certainly basically won an election in 2010, lost the negotiation, which you remember, but basically won that election against Julia Gillard over broken promises.
And this isn't the first one from the current government. They said they wouldn't touch superannuation, and they did. They said power prices would go down by $275 per household per year, and instead they've gone up by at least 20%. They said real wages would go up. Well, they certainly haven't. And now, of course, there's the broken promise on the Stage 3 tax cuts. Now, I think this broken promise on the Stage 3 tax cuts is really serious because it does go to the integrity of the government. This wasn't something that's been forced on them by the crossbench. It wasn't something that's been forced on them by external circumstances. It's a deliberate, premeditated decision of the government, and it comes particularly false from a political party that campaigned on bringing integrity back into government. And again, Peter, you had, I think, a very powerful collection of prime ministerial grabs, one of which was, my word is my bond. Now, he and his treasurer gave their word something like 100 times pre-election, and their word has turned out to be not their bond. So I think this is very damaging for the government, and I think they will and should suffer for it.
Talk to me about Ukraine, because I know you care very much. You've been to Ukraine in recent years during the war. I know you keep in touch with leadership over there. How is it that we're going to tear apart helicopters and bury them rather than give them to Ukraine? How is it that they can make a request for coal and we still can't even get back to them and respond?
Look, I am startled and a little embarrassed that we aren't doing more to help Ukraine. The Ukrainians are fighting for everyone's freedom, not just their own. And as a free country that has suffered a little from bullying by a much larger country, the way China has tried to bully us over trade and other things, we should be absolutely foursquare behind the Ukrainians. We could have given them far more Bushmasters. We should have given them some hundreds of the Hawkeye light armoured vehicles. And given that there was a specific request for these Taipan helicopters, which are still in service with the French and the Germans, we certainly should have provided those. Now, I know the government says that they weren't a particularly good aircraft. Well, if they were that bad, what were they ever doing in our service in the first place? And if they're not that bad, why couldn't they have been given to the Ukrainians? And as for the Ukrainian request for coal, surely the government isn't denying them the coal they want because of some climate issue. If they want the coal, they should be given it.
Well, that might be the reason. Hey, we had a very successful podcast series last year. Can I sign you up again this year?
I've been waiting to be asked.
Terrific. Thanks, Tony. All right, let's go to my panel now. Shadow Environment Minister John O'Donoghue, Senator John O'Donoghue, and Pauline Hanson's One Nation Chief of Staff James Ashby join me now. Both gents, great to have you company. I'll start with you, James. This Talkfest in Canberra, it strikes me as bizarre. They've all been brought to Canberra, costing hundreds of thousands of dollars to discuss cost of living, but we're paying the bill.
Yeah, sure are, and it's you can do your own figures. It's at least $500,000 a day, and then by the time you add staff onto that, you're probably looking at $1 million a day. And what for? It is a talk fest, and at the end of today, you're going to find they're all back at the lodge drinking on the PM's account, which obviously we don't see the cost of that. But let me tell you, it'll be the finest of champagne, wines, and beers, and again at yours and my expense.
Yeah, never get in front of a Labor socialist and a bottle of Grange. I've seen that before firsthand with my own eyes. Jono, issues with building a new home in Australia. Look, we know they're expensive anyway. Mortgages are going up too. Building costs, if you can get a builder, are growing exponentially. But I tell you, it's going to get worse. We're going now from a minimum mandated 6-star rating to 7 stars. These changes are supposed to make us more energy efficient and climate conscious. But how much is this going to add to the price of a new home?
Well, that goal that the Labor Party sets before the last election of building a certain number of houses to house all these people that didn't have them, couldn't afford them, that goal is becoming even further off into the distance because of these sorts of mandated standards that they're bringing in. It is, as you say, extremely expensive to be able to build a home, to buy the land, if you can find a builder. I used to chair the building ministers' meeting, state, territory and Commonwealth ministers, and it always alarmed me that when we were signing up to these targets, we never, ever, ever, or the state and territory ministers, being the only ones who would get a vote at these meetings, would never consider the cost of these standards. It was always purely on whether it was about access or energy efficiency. All of these things do add cost, and it is going to make it much harder in this cost of living crisis to build a home as a result of these changes.
James, this is a huge sleeper issue right around Australia, but firefighters in Queensland are onto it first of all. They're calling for a boycott on e-scooters being modified. They're saying that there's a real chance of fires from these lithium-ion batteries. These are rechargeable batteries. You might buy a decent battery with the bike, but people go and replace them with a Chinese battery on the internet. Fires are happening everywhere. We're getting battery fires, of course, on the scooters. We've got a case of a bike burning down an apartment in North Bondi last week in Sydney. There was a big EV fire at Sydney Airport in September last year. We've certainly seen big EV fires overseas as well. We're being pushed down the way of EVs, but we need to watch this carefully, don't we?
Yeah, we sure do. And especially insurance companies, they'll find any way out of paying out a claim. So if you actually have modified a product and then you find that they do an investigation because it was sparked by it could be a scooter, it could be a electric drill, or it could be, God help us, a lot of these, garden appliances that are now coming out with electric batteries. If you're using something that's not specified for that product, of course, an insurance company is likely to neglect or say, no, I'm sorry, that onus is on you. These are deadly fires, and because so many people's garages are now connected to their house, unlike up here where we've got a bit of extra land where we can have a garage actually built off the house, you're going to find this will put people's lives at risk as well. So, yeah, there's a lot to look out for. If I were you, I just wouldn't buy anything second-hand. You never know whether it's ended up in the drink and it's got future problems. Buy something new, buy something with Australian accreditation, and be very aware not to charge these things overnight. Keep an eye on them.
And I tell you, I want the government to get on top of this before we get EVs forced upon us in a mandatory way as well, electric vehicles. Jono, Islamic leaders, well, they're set to lobby the federal government because they want HECS debts axed for Muslim uni students. They say the debts are considered usury, which is forbidden under Sharia law, but we're not a Sharia law country. And I tell you, as a taxpayer, if we're letting a student borrow money on HECS, I want it paid back with interest. And I don't think religion is a grounds to get out of it.
No, this is an outrageous request, I find. We are governed by the law of Australia, set by the Australian Parliament, which is elected by the Australian people, no matter what their faith background is. And we shouldn't be setting up new arrangements for anyone based on faith when it comes to things like HECS debts. Where would we draw the line? If we do it for one group, we're going to have to do it for another. And so, no, I don't think there should be any special arrangement to give anyone, which it would be an advantage for one group of people based on their faith to not have to pay back a debt that everyone else has to. I know there are some financial institutions that provide Sharia-compliant financing services. Perhaps they can step into the void. But if you want to learn at our universities, and you need to take out a HECS debt to be able to do so, well, the rules are there for all to see, but I don't think we should be setting up a new set of rules to cater to one group of people based on faith alone. A very, very bad precedent.
Hey, James, just quickly, I mean, this New Hampshire win today, 2 for 2. Trump looks unassailable. I think Haley will struggle on until she runs in her own state's primary. Then she's out. Now, yes, it's talking points over there in the US. People are fascinated by this race. I tell you what, there's a lot in the media here and the elites who are nervous to see a return of Trump for the fear that this sort of populist politics, you might call it, but politics designed to shake up the system, lest that arrive here in Australia.
Well, it's called common sense politics, and that's why Trump's getting the support of the Americans. And he will win later on this year. 2025 is going to be a massive year for Trump. Look, they had 2.5 million illegal migrants come across the southern border last year alone. How do you deal with that? We had 50,000 under the Rudd-Gillard years, and we knew how tough that was. The Americans are being smothered by illegal migrants. He wants to reapply tariffs. Who can blame him when China and other developing nations are undermining the American dream and jobs and quality products that have been brought into the country? And of course, he hasn't let up on draining the swamp. Of course, he wants to get rid of so many of those bureaucrats. I think Americans love him. Mark II, Donald Trump, is going to be better than the first Donald Trump we saw when he was first president.
I think every politician is older and wiser and perhaps a little bit more dangerous. Senator Duniam, thank you. James Ashby, great to have you as always. We're after the break. How good's your rhyming slang? Well, Kel's got a whole lot of words and he's going to test you after the break. Welcome back. Well, as we promised ahead of Australia Day, we've got some special Australian words to discuss today with our favourite wordsmith, Kel Richards. Kel, welcome. I tell you, you've got a good list of rhyming slang here. Much I know, my dad loved rhyming slang, but there's a few in here that I've got no idea what they are. So I'll hand it over to you and off you go.
OK, let's go through them. And some you will, like Peter, you'll be familiar with, but some you may not have come across before. You'll actually have come across she'll be apples, but in rhyming slang, we omit the rhyming word. So she'll be apples is short for she'll be apples and spice, she'll be nice. Babblers are babbling brooks, they're cooks. Having a captain's means having a captain cook, a look. A bit of a Barry is, of course, a shocker, a bit of a Barry Crocker. Me old China is me old China plate, me mate. Oh, what's the curry? What's the curry and rice? What's the price? I didn't know that one. I just discovered that.
Aha. I didn't know that one either.
No. And if someone says there's a lot of ducks around, that's short for ducks and geese. There's a lot of police around. Ducks and geese police. Fell over, broke his Lionel Rose, his nose. What about, she's got a great set of gingers, Ginger Meg's legs. Fairly familiar is the idea of he's doing a Harold Holt, a bolt, which not only rhymes with the surname, but it's what he did. I'm feeling a bit Kevin today, a bit Kevin Sheedy, a bit seedy. And that'll be $1, please. $1, one Oxford scholar. So there you are. There's a list of...
I was always told, Cal, that rhyming slang had sort of Cockney origins. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. It was invented by Cockneys and was brought here by Cockney convicts. Pardon me. I had a look at very early rhyming slang, and the only very early convict rhyming slang was the word beef, which was rhyming slang for stop thief. And to put a beef on someone was to actually set up a hue and cry to chase them. Now, that's the only one I've discovered from the very early convict years, but all of this does come from Cockney convicts.
As I said, my dad loved a bit of rhyming slang. When I went to university, we used a lot of rhyming slang there as well. And I think it was probably the 70s or the 80s. There was that comedian Ostentatious who had a #1, I won't call it a song, it was a recitation with that song about Australiana. It's almost like now, given we hate our country, we hate Australia Day, if you listen to the elites, that this sort of stuff is almost a cultural cringe or frowned upon. Are we at risk of losing some of this old rhyming slang?
Not in the bulk of Australia. I think that if you go to Newtown or some of the inner suburbs in our big cities, they don't use it anymore because they're above that. They're far more woke and they're far too politically correct to ever do that. But you get out to the western suburbs of any city, you get into the country towns, this stuff is alive and well. They're still coining it. I was out in a bush town and someone said, oh, mate, he's after a bit of posh and Becks. After a bit of sex. So they're still coining these things. They're still coming up with them. So this is alive and well in mainstream Australia, and politicians who don't realise what mainstream Australia is about cannot read the room, and they don't understand how well we love this place.
All right, just before we go, what's the origin of our national name, Australia?
Originally, there were two names. The left-hand part was called New Holland because it was discovered by the Dutch in the 1600s, and the right-hand part was New South Wales. The whole of the eastern side was New South Wales, from the top to the bottom, no Victoria, Queensland. So all of that was New South Wales. Then Matthew Flinders in 1803 sailed around and discovered the west and the east actually met in the middle, and he said there's got to be one name for it. Well, the name they'd written on the old maps was a Latin phrase. It was Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown South Land. He put those words together and he coined the word Australia. Lachlan Macquarie, when he was governor, took it up and promoted it, and by the 1820s, that was it.
Beautiful. I tell you, how good is he? Thank you, Kel. See you next week. All right, that's it for me. See you tomorrow night at 6. Here's Andrew Bolt.